Hello and welcome to this sample lecture about the Black Death here at Durham University. Now this is the kind of topic that you could study as a portion of a first year module, or even actually we have had an entire special subject at third year dedicated to this subject in the past. So today is only going to be a brief introduction to some of the kinds of themes and topics involved when studying the Black Death. Now, we do know quite a lot about the disease and the course it took throughout medieval Europe. So we have here a slight overview of some of the main themes. As you can see from the moving picture here, that it enters in through parts of around the Black Sea area around Constantinople, through the Italian city-states, and then slowly over the next 2 to 3 years progresses throughout medieval society. Now, this might seem very slow to us, but this is actually an extraordinarily rapid transmission for the Middle Ages. If you think about the level of communication, the level of travel, this is spreading remarkably quickly. Now, this has some implications into thinking about what the actual disease itself was. Now, the other thing that relates to this is the extraordinary high mortality rate. There have been really wide-ranging estimates of this, but historians are agreed that it's between 1/3 and 2/3 of medieval Europe had died in the space of about 3 to 4 years. So roughly half the population of medieval Europe dies during the Black Death. Now these two facts themselves and a range of other have led to massive arguments amongst historians about the identity of the disease itself. Was this bubonic plague? And this was the prevailing theory for a long part of the 19th and 20th centuries. However, in the last few decades of the 20th century, historians began to question this. The disease spread far too quickly for something that is spread by black rats and rat fleas, as we know bubonic plague is. This led to historians suggesting a range of other potential diseases. Could it have been anthrax, for example, which gives similar looking symptoms to the Black Death? Could it have been Ebola, something that spread remarkably quickly and might explain that human-to-human transmission? In the last couple of decades, we have actually arguably put this debate to rest in the fact that we have identified Yersinia pestis, the actual bacillus that creates bubonic plague, in plague pits themselves. So modern science has identified Yersinia pestis as the disease involved. However, there are still large debates surrounding this. Ultimately, how did it spread so quickly? How did it spread so quickly if it's based upon rat fleas leaving rats in a region, going to a human host, and then infecting them? But then what is the level of human-to-human transmission within bubonic plague? Within modern bubonic plague, it's actually relatively low. And one of the things historians are now looking at is how far human fleas in the Middle Ages might have been able to transmit the disease itself. And this might explain to a certain extent some of the speed and the rapidity of the transmission that we see here. Now, what I'm not going to do is get involved in all of those debates today. What I want to look at, rather, is how society responds to this. Okay, so how does society cope with such unprecedented levels of mortality? Mark Bailey, a very eminent medieval historian, has argued that the Black Death stands unchallenged as the greatest disaster in documented human history, claiming the lives of up to half the population of Europe in just a handful of years. But how does medieval society cope with such levels of mortality? How did they respond to this crisis? If you think about this, how far does it lead to the breakdown of family ties, of law and order, and ultimately as well, how does society try to explain this? Certainly medieval medicine didn't have the level of sophistication to understand germ theory and to understand exactly what might have been causing this, although they did give a range of different estimates. Now, one way society responded is, in effect, with religious fervour. Ultimately, in medieval theory, the Black Death must have been caused by God, and therefore the best way to appease God was to repent for their sins. And this led to mass religious hysteria and to large-scale public movements, the most well-known being the Flagellants. The Flagellants were effectively a self-penitential group. They went around, as you can see in the image here, with whips. They stripped themselves of their top halves and went through villages declaring partly potentially the apocalypse was nigh, but also that society had to repent for its sins, and this was the most extreme version of that. We have here a contemporary chronicler describing the Flagellants in action. It's a little bit gruesome, as a fair warning here. So they were called Flagellants because of the whips, the flagella, which they used in performing public penance. Each whip consisted of a stick with 3 knotted thongs hanging from the end. 2 pieces of needle-sharp metal were run through the centre of the knots from both sides, forming a cross, the ends of which extended beyond the knots for the length of a grain of wheat or less. Using these whips, they beat and whipped their bare skin until their bodies were bruised and swollen, and blood rained down, spattering the walls nearby. I have seen, when they whipped themselves, how sometimes those bits of metal penetrated the flesh so deeply that it took more than 2 attempts to pull them out. Now, as gruesome as this is potentially understandable in medieval theory. This is ultimately a form, admittedly a very extreme form, of doing penance for one's sins. And one of the big theories surrounding the Middle Ages and explaining the Black Death was that this was ultimately God's punishment for mankind's sins. Now, we obviously have a very gruesome description here, but we do see contemporaries engage in a range of different forms of mass movements, and some more potentially peaceful versions of this were to go on pilgrimage, were to go, for example, to saint shrines. But one of the things to think about is actually how far all of this was actually counterproductive. Ultimately, if there is a plague going around, the last thing you want to do is A, have big social groupings, and B, actually open wounds and bits of flesh flying everywhere. This is not going to help in terms of stopping the spread of the disease. Now, one of the other responses, and far more serious in many ways, and in many ways related to the Flagellants, was what this religious fervour created. Now, this leads to Jewish pogroms. Ultimately, this is one of the worst cases of anti-Semitism before the 20th century. What happens is that medieval authorities, and to a certain extent driven by the religious fervour of groups and mass movements like the Flagellants, blame their Jewish communities for creating the Black Death. And we see this throughout large parts of continental Europe, and we have here a contemporary description. So the persecution of the Jews began in November 1348, and the first outbreak in Germany was at Solden, where all the Jews were burnt on the strength of a rumour that they had poisoned wells and rivers, as was afterwards confirmed by their own confessions, and also by the confessions of Christians whom they had corrupted and who had been induced by Jews to carry out the deed. Now, what we see across medieval Europe are a range of, first of all, as it suggests here, persecution. So sometimes this is by mass mobs, but also actually by those in authority. Those in authority gather up Jewish communities, they torture them, and they extract these confessions that there is some form of Jewish conspiracy. Now, what we have to understand when we're thinking about this as an explanation are a range of different things about medieval society. First of all, is that Jews have been in many ways persecuted for centuries by this stage. Okay, so medieval authorities have explained and described at length a range of propaganda which presents some form of Jewish conspiracy, and this ultimately leads to this mass outpouring of anti-Semitism during the Black Death. In many ways, the Black Death is the culmination of centuries-long persecution. This has led historians, for example, like Bob Moore, to talk about the formation of a persecuting society. This is ultimately about Christian society blaming groups, whether it's heretics, but also especially Jews, in the light of the Black Death. Now, what we do see, though, is that some in authority did actually question how far this made any sense. And we actually see contemporaries effectively saying this is irrational. And this leads on to the second reason that people were blaming Jews. This is about scapegoating. This is ultimately about those in authority trying to explain the disease and being unable to. So they blame a group, a minority in this case, for the disease. And we can see the Pope himself saying that this doesn't actually make any sense. So Pope Clement wrote that nevertheless it does not seem credible that the Jews on this occasion are responsible for the crime, nor that they caused it, because this nearly universal pestilence, in accordance with God's hidden judgment, has afflicted and continues to afflict the Jews themselves, as well as many other races who were never known to live alongside them throughout the various regions of the world. So in other words, the Jews are also getting sick. It doesn't make sense that they were the cause of this. And this has led to historians debating about what actually causes this outpouring of anti-Semitism. Is this, for example, directed by those in authority, or is this a popular mass movement? Is this, for example, related to Jewish position in medieval society, that many Jews, for example, were moneylenders, and there was a financial incentive behind some of these persecutions? Or is this purely religious? Is this religious fervour? And again, relating back to the flagellants, that many people in society thought this was the end of the world, this was the apocalypse, there were rumours that Antichrist was around, and that Jews formed a really important part of that understanding of the end of the world in Christian society. So we have these two very extreme responses to the Black Death. But what else are we seeing? Now, one of the ways of understanding the Black Death is questioning how far it's a social leveller. Now, medieval society had a range of diseases and famines throughout centuries before the Black Death. But one thing that's really different about the Black Death in many ways is that it didn't respect rank or authority or hierarchy in any real sense. In other words, being slightly wealthier, having a slightly higher living standard, didn't necessarily protect one from the disease. And we see knights dying, we see bishops, we see really high-ranking members of the clergy. The Archbishop of Canterbury dies of the disease. So we see, actually, in many ways, the disease being a social leveller, that it doesn't just take the poorest in society. And this has led to really some big historical debates about how far this changes the way people see society. So Giovanni Boccaccio, for example, who was a mid-14th century writer in Italy, he said that in the face of so much affliction and misery, all respect for the laws of God and man had broken down and been extinguished in our city. Now, in many ways, what we're seeing here is a breakdown of law and order in the immediate aftermath of the disease. But what's actually quite extraordinary is that it doesn't lead to mass riots, to mass revolts or rebellions, and in fact, for large parts of medieval Europe, it's not until a generation afterwards that we start to see that. The Peasants' Revolt in 1381, for example, comes a full 30-odd years after the Black Death. And this is also related to, as you can see here on the slide, a 14th century sermon. And this was complaining that there is scarcely a villein. Now, a villein is a peasant, so there's scarcely a villein today who is satisfied with his lot. Little men are always bustling about to make themselves the equals of their betters, or even, if they can wrangle it somehow, to make themselves greater than them. And this is related to the idea that if medieval peasants are seeing those in authority dying, and also not just that social and cultural aspect of seeing them dying, but also changing the economy itself. If half the population dies, there is suddenly a lot more land available for the survivors. In fact, the living standards of survivors actually massively improves. And this leads to, for example, a real desire amongst those lower down the social order to really achieve freedom. And this is why we see that generation after the Black Death leading towards things like the Peasants' Revolt, where villeins, where peasants did demand their freedom. And this really leads to some concluding points to think about the role of the Black Death in society. How far ultimately was the Black Death a fundamental turning point in the history of medieval Europe? Did it, for example, lead to the irreparable decline of feudalism and of serfdom? If you think back to what I was just saying, this ultimately might lead to a fundamental redistribution of the economy, real changes in living standards, and this leads to the survivors demanding change. You can't go through something, at least potentially this is the theory, as severe and as extreme as the Black Death, where half the population dies, and then just continue as if nothing had happened. So how far does this lead to, for example, new demands for freedom, and also the potential for those demands to be met because of that redistribution of the economy? Did it lead to the questioning of authority, be it lay or religious? And one of the big debates here is how far it leads to the questioning of religion, of ultimately the church's authority. We have a whole range of heretical movements that really take off in the late 14th and 15th centuries, from the Lollards to a whole range of different kind of academic movements, as well as popular mass heresies. And one of the questions for historians is how far does this lead to, effectively, the Reformation and the emergence of Protestantism? Now, potentially it's far too teleological and far too easy to combine those two different debates. But there is a question here of how far contemporaries are at the very least beginning to question religious authority. Ultimately, if the church is saying this is mankind's sins, why can the church not effectively deal with the plague? And this is something to really think about when we're dealing with any of these things, is that the plague comes back year after year, generation after generation, for at least the next 2 centuries. So this is something that medieval society has to deal with for generations to come. So we're not just dealing with the Black Death and that initial dying off of the population, but also the long-term consequences of that endemic plague as well. And finally, did it usher in a new age of effectively rationalism, humanism, or individualism? Ultimately, does this lead, is this a precursor, for example, on the way to both ideas of the emerging of humanism and ultimately leading towards the Renaissance? So ultimately, does this lead to medieval society questioning all of the different aspects of life that they've taken for granted previously? For example, we see autopsies happening, that medieval medicine is trying to explain the disease in ways that it hasn't been able to before. So again, how far are we connecting some of the different changes that we're seeing here with really broad, wholesale, sweeping changes in society? Now, this has been a very brief overview of a very complex topic, but I hope it gives you some insights into the ways that a pandemic might, for example, produce fundamental changes in a society. And I think some of these questions are especially pertinent today, given our recent experiences of coronavirus. So thank you very much for listening to this short introduction to the Black Death, and hopefully I look forward to seeing you in some of our recruitment and admissions events later on this summer. So thank you very much.